Good afternoon. It is July 7th, 2024, and it is the 14th Sunday in Ordinary Time. And our readings this weekend invite us to reflect on the call to be a prophet, to evangelize, to spread the good news. But we sometimes have to stop and really rethink this. Where does that calling come from? And it begins with our baptism. In baptism, we are invited into the family of God. We are made part of the family of God, and we are acknowledged as part of the family of God. There's whole levels involved in there. But when a child is baptized, or an adult is baptized, we are baptized priest, prophet, and king. And each one of those has a responsibility or a consequence of being priest, prophet, and king. Vatican II comes along and reminds us of the importance of this. It's something that was part of the early church. It was part of the early centuries of the church. But somewhere along the line, it seemed to get lost a little bit. We forgot about the prophetic voice of the people. We forgot about the priestly calling of the people. We forgot that we are a kingly people. And as such, the dignity that is entitled to us, or we are entitled to, is very great. We are God's children, loved unconditionally. And God is full of mercy, compassion, and love. So what do we have to rethink here? And part of it goes back to what is baptism. And baptism is being part of this family of God. But if I'm a member of the family of God, I have responsibilities. Love God above all things. And what flows from that is my priestly responsibilities. As an ordained priest, I have certain responsibilities. But the person sitting in the pew, the congregation, they are priestly people too. And part of their responsibility is to give praise and worship to God. And we do that as we celebrate the Mass. The Mass is a dialogue between the priest, who stands in persona Christi, and we have the people. And we dialogue back and forth. But there are certain parts of the Mass that belong to the people of God, to the laity. It begins with the prayers, the Gloria, the readings, the Psalm, right? The prayers of the faithful. All of these are part of the people's responsibility. The hymns that we sing are part of the people's responsibility. Do we understand that? Do we understand our role? And as a priest, oftentimes standing at the front of the church looking out, you don't see a lot of lips moving. But where's your full and active participation? Vatican II comes along and reminds us of the early church and our call to full and active participation in the celebration of the Mass. Are we there yet? And part of that full and active participation is recognizing the fact that the congregation is the choir. The people over in the corner, wherever they are leaders of song. Their job is not to sing for the people. Their job is to get the people to sing along with them or to sing louder and cry out to God. As the old saying goes, if God gave you a voice, sing. If God didn't give you a voice, sing louder and maybe he'll fix it. But we're all called to sing out, which leads us to the second part of our baptismal responsibilities, our prophetic voice. The congregation, as the choir, is supposed to go out and spread the good news. They are supposed to proclaim the good news. Jesus Christ risen for our salvation. But do we go out? Do we proclaim the good news? And sometimes we forget that it's in the very, very simple actions of our lives that we become the prophet, right? And one of those simple ways is just going to a restaurant and praying out loud. You go to a restaurant, your meal is served. Do you pray? Do you make the sign of the cross? Do you publicly declare that you are Catholic, you're proud of it, and I am here to give praise and worship to God anywhere? Or in our homes. One of the things I find very challenging as a priest nowadays is you go into people's homes, you can't find a crucifix, you can't find a statue, you can't find a holy picture. It's like the whole house has been sanitized and God has been removed. But the home is the domestic church. It is the first church that the child is raised in. But if there's no crucifix, there's no statue, there's no holy picture, how do we find God in the midst of all of that? When we walk into a church, there's a giant crucifix, there's statues, there's stained glass windows, there's all of that that tells us this is God's house. But in the case of a small child growing up, they're tactile. Part of it is they need to touch, they need to see. Telling them that God lives here does nothing. It does nothing for us as adults either. But when somebody walks into your house and there's a crucifix on the wall, or there's a holy picture, or there's a statue, without saying anything, you proclaimed your faith. You've been prophetic. You might actually start a conversation out of that where somebody says, who is that? What is that statue? And you go, well, my husband is forever losing his keys, and so St. Anthony is a good friend of our family because he's constantly having to find my husband's keys. Simple case of proclaiming our faith without being abusive or overreactionary or challenging. It is what we are. And so they can like it, they cannot like it, doesn't matter. But we're called to profess our faith. Praying in the restaurant. What do you have in your house? And your house is the domestic church. It's the first place that the child should learn to pray. It's the first place the child should learn to have a relationship with Jesus Christ. And finally, we move to the dignity of the person. We are a kingly people. We are God's children by adoption. And as such, we have great dignity. But do we recognize it in ourselves, and do we recognize it in one another? We go back to the domestic church. Okay, how is the dignity of the child, how is the dignity of the members of the family affirmed in word and action? And so when we sit down and we look at the readings and we recognize, Jesus says the prophet is never welcome in his own town. Well, that's true enough. But he also said, blessed are those who are persecuted and reviled for my name's sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Jesus didn't stop trying to do something. He just recognized the fact that people were of little faith. In our world today, here in Canada, at one time, we were a Christian country. We're not anymore. We're very much a secular country. But we still have a responsibility in the midst of all of that. And I think part of the problem is we're actually not really a secular country. We just don't want to admit that we believe in God. Because if I tell people I believe in God, then I may or may not have to change the way I live. Because oftentimes it's like when somebody says, I thought you were a Catholic, I thought you were a Christian, why are you doing this? Our witness is probably our greatest prophetic voice. And so, do we recognize ourselves when we go to church? Do we see ourselves as a priestly people? In our own homes, do we see ourselves as priestly people? Do we pray and do we lead prayer? Do we see our prophetic voice in every word and action that we do? And do we understand ourselves and the dignity that we have as God's children? It is July 7th, 2024. It's the 14th Sunday in Ordinary Time. There's some things that we need to reflect on. It's summertime, quiet time, maybe read a good book, maybe do some reflection. But how do you understand yourself as priest, prophet, and king? May God bless you, watch over you, keep you safe all the days of your life.